Hey guys, it's Miss Levy, and we are here to learn about the differences between the Central Business District in the United States compared to Western Europe. Then we're going to look at settlement patterns outside of both in countries like Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Specifically, we're going to talk a little bit about squatter settlements today. So please access these guided notes so that you may fill them in as we take a look at the next slides. So let's just refer back to what the CBD means, so the Central Business District. Remember, this is the center of the city. This is the downtown area of cities. This is typically one of the oldest parts of a city. You tend to see a large percentage of shops, offices, public institutions. This tends to be very attractive for services to locate there because it's the easiest part of the city to reach. It's very accessible because it's the focal point of the region's transportation network. Tends to be where both rail and highways will. So just like in downtown Orlando, where you see the rail and highways converge. Typically in LDCs, the CBD, you will see the CBD, and then there'll be a wide boulevard that connects the cities and the wealthy within the cities. It's most likely that this was built during the colonial periods. And so when we look at the similarities and differences between cities in U.S. and Western Europe, please find this graphic. It's on 13.1, the guided notes, the very last part. So let's talk about these differences between the cities in U.S. and Western Europe. Let's talk about in geographic size. In the United States, our cities tend to be larger. They tend to have much more urban sprawl. This is because of this phenomenon of suburbanization in the United States, where you have the wealthy and middle class tend to want to live out in the suburbs. So that's led to the sprawl of the city size, especially in the South and the West, where there is a lot more newer construction and also less barriers to this expansion because the land typically is much more flat. In Western Europe, the cities tend to be much more compact. You tend to see less urban sprawl, so complete opposite here. Less urban sprawl because many of the residents tend to want to live closer to the city center, and the streets tend to be much more narrow. You have to keep in mind that many of these cities are very old, built during a time whenever it was more pedestrian and horse and buggy. Next, let's talk about the difference between the height and design of the buildings in the CBD. United States, typically the CBDs are marked by skyscrapers, so these very tall buildings build up, not out, because the land is so expensive. Typically the most expensive land in a city is there in the CBD. Tend to be much more postmodern design, so steel and glass, very, very modern. And it tends to be the center of the business activity, both retail and office. In Western Europe, cities in Western Europe, the cities tend to have much more flat profile. Most of the buildings are 5 stories or less. They tend to have this historic style. They're typically 5 stories or less because they want to preserve that historic skyline. Many of the cities, there are laws in place that prevent them from building that higher than the most important historic styles, most important historic site. And as is the same in Western Europe as the United States, it is the center of the business activity, both retail and office. So business activity, not personal services. We're talking about business activity. Next, let's talk about the importance of public space. These are open green spaces. In the United States, we tend to be much more car-oriented. That's because more people live in suburbs. So they commute into the cities from the suburbs for their jobs, and then they go back out to the suburbs to live. So what this has then led to is that the mall has taken the place of traditional public spaces rather than in the city. When people want to go to gather or to shop for more personal type services, they tend to go to the mall. However, in the United States, we do recognize the need for parks and other public spaces. In Western Europe, tend to be much more pedestrian-oriented. You have pedestrian-only streets in a lot of the cities in Western Europe. They want to preserve their plaza areas, their park areas, their historic sites, and other public spaces and parks are very important to them. And they recognize the need for parks and other public spaces there as well. So a commonality between the two. They have this in common. Next, let's talk about the patterns of economic class to social class. This is the complete opposite between the United States and Western Europe. In the United States, the wealthiest people, the upper classes, and then the middle class people, they tend to live outside of the city in suburbs. And the size of home and the type of car in the United States is a status symbol. This is how we display our wealth in size of car and size of house and type of car. And so where can you have a bigger house and show off your fancy car if not in the suburbs? Because keeping in mind the land close to the city is very expensive. And in the inner city, you tend to see the lower income people living. That's why so many of the cities have faced severe problems, and why many of them are pushing for gentrification, which we will learn about in 13.3. In Western Europe, it's the complete opposite. The upper class and the middle class, they tend to live closer to the city centers, next to the historic areas. And this is, since the beginning of their cities, it was a sign of real privilege and importance and wealth if you lived near the aristocracy, who tended to live closer to the city centers. In addition, the low-income people tend to live on the outskirts of the city. So again, complete opposite there in settlement pattern. Next, let's talk about ethnic neighborhoods. In Western Europe, you tend to see less distinct ethnic neighborhoods. They're more likely to be in the suburban margins on the outskirts of the cities, and they tend to be more static, more permanent. They tend to be in the same locations over time. In the United States, these ethnic neighborhoods tend to be very clearly defined. They're typically around the inner cities, and within the inner cities, the low-income areas, different ethnicities, they tend to cluster together. This oftentimes is because of clustering. It's also because of chain migration. And in the United States, this pattern is much more significant in that socioeconomic is a defining factor. However, these ethnic neighborhoods in the United States, the cities, tend to be much more dynamic. They tend to shift location as the economic circumstances of the immigrants change. And so as they gain or lose wealth, they will tend to move around to different parts around the city. So that brings us to what our cities then look like outside of Western Europe and outside the United States. And so when we look at the cities in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, they tend to have gone through three periods: pre-colonial, their colonial times, and their cities since independence. Please answer these questions that are on the guided notes using the information in the textbook for those three sections. Now, since independence, millions of people have migrated to the cities in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. It's caused this significant rural to urban migration pattern. And so you have many more poor people living in the cities. Let's take a look at this Latin American settlement patterns. Typically, they have been, same with the cities in Africa and Asia and Latin America, they've been significantly affected by their colonial power. The Europeans, when they colonized, they tended to want to replicate whatever it is that they had left because they felt like that their European ways were more superior. So they even built their cities. Sometimes they knocked down the native cities and rebuilt them in the colonial style. So in cities in Latin America, you'll see that they have the wide boulevard and the area of wealthy people and the mall area and the promenade area. And then you will see that there are plazas and marketplaces that are the center of these communities. So when we look at this Latin American model, first thing you should notice is that it's a hybrid between the sector model and the concentric zone model. And we can see that they have the CBD, the market, down at the center of the city. Then there's the spine, which is the boulevard, wide boulevard, or the promenade down to the mall area, which can be a promenade or social. Right next to that spine, that mall, the boulevard, wide boulevard, you have their wealthiest housing. Then in the blue, you'll see that that's the middle class housing. And then surrounding in the yellow, these are our squatter settlements, our slums. The slums tend to be on the outskirts, just like in this model. They tend to be near some of your more industrial areas and such. Let's look at this idea of squatter settlements. You see squatter settlements in LDC, in cities, in LDCs and DCs. Remember, these are housing settlements and patterns around cities in LDCs and DCs. We do not have squatter settlements, slums, in MDCs. We have low-income areas and low-income housing, but we do not have squatter settlements. We do not have slums. And so these are built from very primitive materials and primitive structures. We will look at this in more detail whenever we look and zoom in at these pictures. And because of this widespread rural to urban migration pattern, and it's happening so quickly, you see that the percentage of people living in squatter settlements in the slums and other illegal housing ranges from 33% in Sao Paulo, Brazil. That means a third of the people in Sao Paulo, Brazil live in a squatter settlement, to 85% of the people in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. That means 85% of the people in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia live in a squatter settlement, a slum. Let's take a look at some of the reasons why and where they form. So where do they form? They form on the edge, the outskirts of a city in DCs and LDCs. The wealthy people tend to live in the center. They live on the edge, the outskirts. They tend to live on the most undesirable land. It's usually vacant at first, but then they build very rapidly on this land. It tends to be in undesirable areas like very steep hillsides, floodplains, dumps, landfills, cemeteries, or close to industrial areas. It tends to be on land with an unclear owner, so there's no clear ownership of the land. It could be the government, or it could be that it's not yet clearly defined who owns it, but it isn't free and it isn't open land. It is owned by someone. It's just not being enforced, that ownership. So why do they form? This is a result of this large-scale rural to urban migration pattern. People move to the cities for better jobs. It typically is a part of the phenomenon of chain migration, that they move where somebody else from their family or community have moved before. And because there are so many people who are moving into the city from the countryside, there just isn't enough affordable housing for these people who are moving in there, either public, provided by the government, or private. It's happening so quickly, this migration pattern and settlement pattern, that they cannot build infrastructure or housing fast enough. In addition, there's a lack of enforcement or existence of land use policy. So the government, because there could be millions of people living in these slums, 83% or 85% of the people in Addis Ababa, the government can't afford to make these people so angry, so they don't typically kick them off this land. And because of the extreme poverty in parts of the rural or parts of the urban area, the squatter settlements are better than what is available to the people in some of the rural areas, or better than living on the streets. They end up in these squatter settlements because they can't afford anything else, because there aren't any jobs. Keeping in mind, these people are not homeless people. They do live in primitive dwellings. It's just that they live on undesirable land that they do not own. And so there are significant consequences to these squatter settlements, like unhealthy living conditions caused by diseases that lead to high death rates. They lead to an increase in crime because people will do whatever it takes to survive. And because there is no real police presence, you see the development of gangs that use force to enforce rules in the settlement. Because of this lack of police presence, and because of the lack of social services and access to electricity and water and sewage and schooling and transportation, there's typically a lot of political unrest. You have a large number of people who are very unhappy with the government, and they tend to act out against the government. You see an increased water pollution because of lack of sanitation and garbage facilities, so people are just throwing this human waste and garbage waste out. You tend to see a lot of soil erosion on the hillsides, danger of slides when it rains because of the amount of people living there. You see a decrease in air quality because of the fires used for cooking and heating, because they don't have electricity, so they're using kerosene. There's deforestation because they're cutting down the material to use for their land. You see visual pollution like trash and other materials there. And because of the increase in availability of cheap labor, which is unskilled, you see very low wages, so it's very hard for the people to improve their conditions. You see an increased risk of disasters like fires and mudslides and floods. Because there's no foundation to these dwellings and they're on hillsides, when it rains, there's a significant issue with mudslides and fires because they are tapping in illegally to the electrical system sometimes. So there's this wiring issues, and they're using kerosene to cook. And they're so close together that if a fire breaks out, it spreads very quickly. And finally, for the government, one of the biggest issues is it strains the already inadequate and underdeveloped infrastructure. because there just isn't enough water, not enough electricity, not enough education services. There isn't enough sewage systems, police and